Hello, everyone. My name is Timothy Hampton. I'm the director of the Doreen B. Townsend Center for the Humanities at the University of California at Berkeley. Welcome to today's Berkeley Book Chat. The Berkeley Book Chats feature a member of the UC Berkeley Arts and Humanities faculty discussing recent work with a colleague. Today, we're very happy to welcome Professor Joshua Gang of the English Department, discussing his new book, Behaviorism, Consciousness, and the Literary Mind. He will be in conversation with Daniel Wright of the English Department at the University of Toronto. Let me add that it's a particular pleasure to hear about this book today, since Josh was a fellow in the Townsend Center 2 years ago when he was working on the manuscript. It's always great to see how work in the Townsend Center Fellows Program results in faculty research coming to light. Before I turn things over to our guests, I want to say a word about upcoming events. First off, I have some disappointing news. As you know, we were planning to welcome this year's Avenatti Professor of the Humanities, Saidiya Hartman of Columbia University, for a set of events on April 27th and 28th. However, we've just learned yesterday from Professor Hartman that she will not be able to join us due to circumstances beyond her control. So those events are all canceled. However, we will be hosting one more book chat a week from today on April 20th. Timothy Hampton of the Departments of Comparative Literature and French will be talking about his new book titled Cheerfulness, A Literary and Cultural History. I hope you can join us then. Feel free to consult our website for a full calendar of events sponsored through the Townsend Center. As we turn now to today's event, let me remind you that our guests will speak for about 3/4 of an hour, and then the floor will be open to questions from the audience. So please use your chat function to transmit your questions. Now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Joshua and Danny. Welcome to the Townsend Center.
Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone at the Townsend Center for all your support in getting this event together. It's a real joy and delight to be here talking to Josh about this book, a book that I had the privilege of knowing a little bit about over many years, and it's such a pleasure to read it in its finished form and to have this conversation. And I thought that I would begin, Josh, by inviting you to sort of introduce the book in whatever way you'd like to sort of get us all on the same page and help to contextualize the book and its argument for us.
Thanks, Danny, and thank you, Tim, and to the entire Townsend Center, both for today, but also for a fellowship a few years ago, without which none of this would have been possible. It's hard to overstate how much I gained, both intellectually and practically speaking, from that year at the Townsend Center. As far as the book, so in many ways, the book is an attempt to think about what I consider one of the most sort of fundamental problems of literary experience or aesthetic experience. And that is how works of art, in my case specifically, literary texts such as novels, poems, how they create the impression of having human minds. And the way I go about analyzing this problem is through behaviorism, which has a bad reputation as a school of psychology and philosophy, in as much as it's said that people don't have minds. And I'm being pretty crude in my summary behaviorism here, but it said people don't have minds. What you think of as minds are misunderstood or misperceived things like reflexes or any number of other things going on in the human body. And because it denies that people have minds, behaviorism is really a very bad way of understanding why humans act the way they do. But in as much as it's a way of supposedly analyzing mental states where no mental states should exist, it's a great way for thinking about how novels and poems and plays are able to create these illusions whereby we start to think of ourselves as having the same type of mind as a character, or even the same type of mind as might be represented by an author's written style. So that then becomes an opportunity to actually trace behaviorism's literary history in as much as the ways it influenced or angered any number of writers and the ways that they wrote about it, wrote against it. But that history is in very many ways a means to an end, that the focus of the book really is conceptual. And as much as anything else, an opportunity, I hope, for people to think about the ways they read and the kinds of things that have to be the case in order for their experiences to be what they are.
Thanks, Josh. That final point that you made actually is a perfect segue into one of the big questions that I had for you about reading behavioristically, as you put it in the introduction to the book. You say that to read behavioristically is to take behaviorism not as a critical method, but as a critical sensibility that would strengthen the logical and epistemological foundations of literary study more broadly. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what's at stake for you in that shift from method to sensibility. And that term sensibility, I think, is an important one to you. It kind of reappears a few times throughout the book. What is the difference between a method and a sensibility for you? And what do you hope a sensibility does for us that a method might not do?
Well, that's a really good question. A couple of things. One, I'm pretty committed to close reading as a method for literary study, not only because of the way I was trained. So close reading has a certain kind of familiarity that I appreciate and make use of, but also because I think close reading's own history has been so determined by this process by which readers learn to perceive minds or learn to ignore mental states in what they read and so on. The reason I emphasize sensibility was one, that I really did want to emphasize this idea of judgment and of this being part of a process rather than the sort of a method in its entirety, rather than sort of defining the object of interest or the ways that you talk about that. Instead, it becomes something that enters into that process of deliberation as you determine, what a text is saying, why it says those things in the ways that it does. But I also, I found myself wanting a word that invoked something slightly meditative, perhaps. I don't think that's quite what sensibility means, but I think what I really wanted was a word almost in the sort of, the long history of the term that would sort of intervene in between sensation and, like I said, judgment. A way of actually pausing and thinking about what we are sensing and moving from there, rather than, as I said, kind of reshaping literary text through a methodology that, that doesn't necessarily hit the notes that literary critics want to hit. I think the other thing is, part of the book's own argument is that close reading itself is a version of behaviorism. So having a behavioristic methodology for what is already partly a behavioristic methodology, it was too many things for me to keep track of. So I think sensibility was preferable.
There's another kind of related term that I was thinking about a lot in terms of this method and sensibility distinction, which is theory. It seems to me that this book proposes a really thrilling theory about how literature works. But you never use that word in relation to your own argument. I checked. I did my Google book search and made sure that I was correct on this. You never describe your argument as proposing a theory. And so partly I want to ask you to talk about that, because it sort of maybe plays into this conversation about the differences between, method, sensibility, approach, theory, but also because, as I thought about it, your focus in your readings of literary criticism, drama, the novel, frequently focus on how works of literature or works of literary criticism formulate, enact, test, push the limits of various theories about the relationship between fictionality and actuality, the relationship between literary minds and literary bodies, language and the mind, introspection and observation. These are all objects of theorization, whether at the level of form. So I'm thinking, in your chapter on Beckett and Pinter as playwrights, they're sort of formal experiments with mise en scène as, in some sense, proposing theories about these various questions, and also at the level of character, right? Characters in Beckett's novels developing and testing theories about how introspection works, for example. So I wonder sort of what you make of that, your book maybe as a theory about how literature makes theories, or a theory about how literature formulates theories about itself, or something like that.
It's really funny. As you were saying it, it made total sense to me, but I didn't realize that I wasn't using the word theory. I mean, if the word theory comes up, it probably only comes up in the phrase something like theory of mind, when it is specifically, the theories of Woodruff et al. I mean, I would have no problem using the word theory, although my guess is, if I had to sort of speculate as to why I didn't use the word, it was probably because I wanted to be sort of crystal clear about the terms I was using. And in as much as theory of mind uses the word theory in a way that is very, very different from the way theory is used in literary studies, if I had to sort of reflect on, frankly, knowledge I am currently missing from my own mind, my guess was probably trying to just keep terms straight. But I also think, my own disposition is that as much as I have benefited from literary theory writ large, and I'm very much indebted to it, and I include, any number of the writers that I discuss in the novel, and the critics as well. I just don't refer to them as theorists. I am, I guess, a little suspicious sometimes of theory qua theory, in as much as I think it's been necessitated by virtue of our not attending to our experiences as readers, or not thinking about the entailments of the concepts we use. So I have absolutely no problem describing this book as offering a theory of why we experience literature in some of the ways that we do. I have no problem calling it that. But I would use theory in a pretty limited sense there. Like it really is a kind of a ventured argument, and one that, while it could be generalized in certain ways, my own instinct is often against generalization until I can sort of work the problem out logically.
I mean, I guess I want to press a little bit on that second part of my question about the theory making capacities of literary characters, for example, in Beckett's novels, because I think that, to be clear, that is where you use the word theory frequently. Is this character, has a theory about how he can observe his own mind, and he tests it in such and such a way.
So I do use the word there.
Absolutely, yes.
Oh, sorry,
that's where it comes up frequently, right? Is in Pinter has, uses this kind of divided mise en scène of onstage and offstage to, develop and test a theory about how mental acts can be sort of represented or not represented on stage. So I wonder if maybe we could press on that a little bit more, because I think there's something really interesting there, in your theorization of literature as, self-theorizing in some way. Literary characters, right? So much of the argument of this book is about how literary minds are their own kinds of things, unlike actual minds in many ways, unlike actual minds in being made only of language. And that in some sense, characters in novels seem to be aware that that's how their minds are constructed, or they seem to have the capacity to theorize their own, fictional linguistic existence, and to then sort of figure out a theory of, for example, the relationship between introspection and observation of the mind, that works in the context of the novel, but might not work in the context of thinking about actual minds.
Yeah, I don't think that's an inappropriate model to use, in as much as there is that kind of movement between empirical knowledge and extrapolation. I think what most people would possibly dislike about that is, even though I do talk about things like characters and mise-en-scène, for my purposes, the differences between, a character's mental state, proverbial mental states, and the mental states or mental rules implied by style, I really don't draw a distinction between them logically. And that's why I'm able to sort of chart them as operating along related lines. I guess the question then becomes, if these are all offering different theories, are these theories compatible with each other? And I mean, in a way they are, in as much as we still somehow recognize them as working in ways similar to our own minds. Ultimately, I think that is the test of compatibility, rather than whether they all end up saying the same things about the way the mind works, in part because I really believe that in order for us to recognize or, implicitly compare our minds to what we see in a text, we don't need anything fully realized. It can be the smallest amount of information on the page that causes us to make certain inferences and to start reading in a slightly different way.
You've set me up again perfectly for another question that I had, because there's this, which is just wonderful. There's this, I'm going out of order now in my plan of what I was going to ask you, but it's too perfect. There's this line in the introduction to the book that I just really love. You argue there that while this is, where you're sort of distinguishing between actual minds and literary minds, really important aspect of the book's argument, right? That literature encourages or requires a kind of category mistake by which we think that actual minds and literary minds are comparable or analogous or isomorphic in some way, and that they aren't, right? As we've been talking about, literary minds are made of language, whereas actual minds may be something else. So you say in the introduction, while actual minds must be embodied and attributed, this isn't true of literary minds. All a literary mind needs is a small amount of language that either purports to represent a mental state or implies the existence of mental activity. It isn't necessary for this language to be embodied by or attributed to a thinking subject. And it's that you reminded me in what you were just saying of that phrase that I just adored and set my mind thinking in all kinds of ways. All a literary mind needs is a small amount of language. So maybe this is an invitation to say more about, I was thinking about it as a sort of interestingly minimalist theory about the relationship between language and literary minds, or maybe even a kind of like parsimonious theory of the relationship between language and literary minds. And I wonder what that's about, right? What do actual minds need? It seems like they need a bigger quantity of something than literary minds need. Anyways, I have more thoughts on that, but first I'd be really interested to hear just your sort of general thoughts, that idea of the small amount of language required to make a literary mind emerge out of a novel or a play.
Yeah. As far as the empirical question of what actual minds need to perceive other actual minds, I have to defer to people in other disciplines for that. I mean, I have some rough ideas based on my own experience, but I don't think that would be meaningful in any way. Yeah, and in terms of literary minds only needing a small amount of language, I mean, in some ways there, I am being a little coy. because it's not just language, right? It is a set of reading practices that is either implicit or being taught explicitly. It's things like implicature. It's things like that sort of, loose, baggy concept context. But all you need is, say, the difference between, my favorite example is always a stop sign. So a stop sign that says stop, to my mind, does not imply any kind of mental activity, in as much as we are not trained to read stop signs that way, right? We are not trained to read them as being said by a person to you as a person, right? It's a different use of language. However, if a stop sign didn't say stop, but rather stop, comma, you, that changes everything. Suddenly, there's a kind of individuation on the part of the reader or the driver that then implies that you have been singled out. And in the process of singling out, it implies that what is being said might actually be operating according to mental rules, as opposed to a more general sort of, this is the safest place to stop, we all agree. And in that way, it is a statement of, almost, the universe rather than a person's opinion. So, even, you might not even need that much. It could just be an exclamation point at the end of stop, enough to break the habit of reading the stop sign in the way you're accustomed to suddenly going, whoa, 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 is it just me? That changes everything. I think sometimes there is a tendency for readers, at least I think readers who have been taught to read literature in certain ways, to psychologize aspects of text they don't understand or that surprise them. I think that is a related but slightly different phenomenon. I think that happens often because we are accustomed to doing this other thing as well.
There's a kind of connected pattern in the book that I wanted to invite you to talk about, because, and this might come from the context, I think it does, at least on my understanding of the book and the history of behaviorism that you offer there. I think this pattern of language comes from behavioristic language about how we think we know minds, or how we come to sort of project the idea of mind onto behaviors. It sort of emerged for me. This is a connected moment in the introduction when you say that you invoke David Chalmers's famous phrase, the hard problem of consciousness, how subjective experience emerges from physical matter is the hard problem of consciousness. And you say that the apparent emergence of mental properties from language is then the hard problem of literature. And it was that phrase, mental properties, that sort of started to circle in my mind. And as I was reading, and especially thinking about the title of the book and that phrase, the literary mind, that appears in the title, that phrase, the literary mind and literary minds, appears throughout the book, but so too do these phrases like mental properties, with the adjectival form of mental attached to lots of different kinds of nouns. Mental properties, mental actions, mental world, mental events, mental phenomena, mental processes, mental states. And so I guess, I'm interested to know how we can sort through this terminology when it comes to thinking about the literary mind or literary minds. Is it that minds or the mind emerge from literary language, as you're talking about in describing this hard problem of literature as being about the emergence of mental properties? Is that about the emergence of a mind, or minds in the plural? Or is it, on the other hand, that literature, that out of literature emerges these kinds of like mental things, various mental bits and pieces, and that perhaps we as readers, we as critics, are the ones who are, in reading behavioristically, sort of reasoning inductively from those mental bits and pieces in order to construct something like what we think is a mind or the mind out of processes, states, events, etc.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. in part because I don't think the emergence of literary minds from language is strictly comparable to the emergence of mental properties from physical objects. That's it's more of a rhetorical turn than a logical claim, although I do maintain that the empirical question of how we do, we perceive minds where none could exist really is one of the defining hallmarks of at least, say, literature after the novel. Forgive me, could you repeat the second half of your question? I want to answer it, but I
mean, it's partly about this distinction between mental X versus what we would call a mind or even the mind. I mean, somewhat in the background of my question, to sort of like give it all away, is Frege, who has this really important distinction in his work between the mind, which is the object of investigation for logic and mathematics, for example, the mind as an abstract object, the mind as like the thing that all of our minds are sort of like, individuated versions of, versus minds. And that's also, it's a distinction that's really central to Cora Diamond's work as well in the realistic spirit. That was sort of in the background of my thinking about this question, but maybe not necessarily central to the question. So, I guess part of the question is reading with a behavioristic sensibility. What does that mean in terms of this distinction between, for example, the literary mind of the book's title versus literary minds? And maybe then this further distinction between literary minds and the mental properties, mental actions, mental states that seem somehow to be like the ingredients for any given literary mind. I guess I'm just really interested in how those, how that hierarchy breaks down, how those component parts come together. Is it the work of the novel to cause mental states and processes to emerge out of language and to coalesce into something like a literary mind? Or is that where the work of reading and criticism comes in, that we as readers are inductively reasoning, inductively creating some concept of a mind, the mind, out of what is in fact a really piecemeal, fragmentary, bits and pieces kind of representation of the mind in literature?
Yeah, no, I think it's that one. I mean, it's not a emergence in the sort of physical sense. And I also think we recognize these minds in reading because we have been trained to do so, maybe not explicitly told this is how you generate a literary mind, but rather through any number of other linguistic conventions that we learn, and that also through a lot of associations, that a lot of this is not intentional on anyone's part. In terms of the hierarchy, it's funny you see one there, because that's really not how I have it organized in my mind. By virtue of the kind of fragmentary nature of the literary mind, I very consciously I never subordinated those fragments to a whole. There was never an ideal literary mind. There were only these abstractions that you could encounter and read in certain ways, and not everyone would read them that way. And in that way, you might say it was a more kind of an understanding of the literary mind that was more empiricist in certain ways, psychology without a soul, in contrast with what I acknowledge to be a very kind of casual, problematic, hammy understanding of actual minds at the beginning, where I talk about myself and I have certain abilities and I don't have other abilities. And I treat it as a sort of conceptual whole. I'm trying to think. I mean, but I think in my own work as well, I would actually, however, implicitly treat the actual self as also sort of still being that collection of properties or or isolated phenomena.
So I'll ask you a question. So to return to the stop sign question, so I was wondering, so you said if it says stop, it does one thing. If it says stop you, it does something else. Well, living in Berkeley, California, as I do, I see stop signs all the time that say things like stop eating meat or stop war. So what is that? How does that change our response to and the creation of mind or lack thereof?
I mean, I think it depends, frankly, on what we're being told to stop doing.
Okay.
And I also think there's a degree of habituation involved.
Right.
Which is to say that, seeing it for the first time, you might read it differently than seeing it for the fifth or sixth time.
Okay.
And I also think we are capable of reading objects in more than one way at once.
Right.
And that's where I would sort of go with that. But I also think that that when you then see the stop eating meat stop sign, unless the rule following of the stop sign suddenly disappears, I think that you are perhaps still less likely, for one reason or another, to impute mental states to it. Although you absolutely could. Right. A lot of this is based on personal experience, which I think in many ways is the weirdest thing about this book, that it essentially is me trying to extrapolate from my own very peculiar practices as a reader and kind of pretending we're all the same, but inviting everyone to disagree with me.
Yeah. That's the best kind of criticism. I see that Danny is back. So why don't I step off again and I'll turn it back over to the two of you.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you for filling in. Something went very wrong with my Wi-Fi. I'm now, I think, back, and I hope permanently. I'm going to jump back in. I missed some things. I heard that there was more about the stop sign, but I missed it, and I'm very sad to have missed it.
No worries at all.
Why don't we jump back in here? One of the things I wanted to ask you about, as somebody who also works at this kind of intersection between philosophy and literature, one of the things that I love most about this book is the way that you treat that interdisciplinarity. There's an argument in the book about how behaviorist theories, even after, as you were pointing out in your introductory remarks, even after they're debunked in the field of psychology, and maybe especially in the field of cognitive linguistics, or after they've kind of just like gone out of fashion in philosophical thinking about the mind, sort of find a new and better and more productive home in literature. And so I wonder if we could talk about, that as a way of thinking about interdisciplinarity. There's something there about the sort of migration of key problems or questions. I think of it as this, the kind of a problem wandering around searching for a home. And their literature is to kind of accommodate the question in the way that it needs to be accommodated. Or also searching for the place, the discourse, the genre, the form that actually most benefits from the kinds of question, the kind of problem being posed here. So in other words, disciplinarity or, interdisciplinarity as being less about sort of territorial boundary marking between academic departments and more about questions seeking sort of fertile ground for their development.
Well, I have a pretty idiosyncratic notion of interdisciplinarity, because at one level, I agree with you completely. It really is about things moving around, finding fertile homes. And case in point, I say behaviorism is terrible for talking about people, great for talking about books. At the same time, and I know you and I have disagreed about this before, I also have a real sort of skepticism about the set of practices that are often talked about in terms of interdisciplinarity, because I do think that there is often a real distance between disciplines. And I am reluctant to to overlook that distance. I actually think that distance is in many ways the most fascinating thing. And a way of talking about that distance would simply be to say certain changes have to be made in order for this problem or for this object to be made not only intelligible, but meaningful for another discipline. And I think that's the key there, that you do need to acknowledge that changes have to happen, whether it is the object of analysis or certain sort of changes to method. At the risk of being too technical, you need something almost like a bridge law to go between them, because otherwise you really do risk this idea that, what you are talking about isn't meaningful for someone who works in psychology and vice versa.
And I sort of wonder whether there's a connection between, this set of problems about the distance, as you're describing it, between different disciplines. And, I'm interested in this language, what needs to happen in order for this, question to migrate from here to there. And, the book very intentionally and purposefully sort of eschews historical or periodizing frame. And, because we know each other well, that I'm quite sympathetic to that approach and don't think that's a problem. But I still want to ask you sort of what it means to you to think in that way. There's a kind of quasi-historical approach that you describe in the book, right? You are interested in thinking about a set of writers who were familiar with the work of the behaviorists. There is a kind of historical contemporaneity between the behaviorist thinkers that you're working with and the writers you're working with. There are also writers who mostly belong to the historical period that literary scholars call the modernist period. This might be a way of just sort of asking you to talk a little bit about kind of the process of conceptualizing the book, how it changed at various stages in its life, how it changed, from a project that might have at one time been pitched as being about modernism to something different. I think that might be especially helpful for, dissertating graduate students and early career scholars that we have in the audience, right, who are thinking about how to strategize these questions, because they're sort of pragmatic questions in addition to being theoretical questions. So I thought maybe it would be nice for you to talk about that.
Yeah. I think your description of the book's kind of historical scope is absolutely right. And you know all too well that I am not especially interested in questions of periodization. I don't mind them, but certainly in what is often described as, my period or your period, there's a certain kind of logical sleight of hand in the terms that are used and distortions that result. For instance, you're called a Victorianist, even though you weren't alive back then, certainly. And I'm called a modernist, even though it really doesn't make sense to talk about modernism as a period so much as something that was happening, yes, at a certain time, but not everyone was doing it. The book began as sort of two impulses, which had to sit next to each other for a long time in order for me to make sense of them. And it started really with me reading any number of 20th century texts, which was my go-to field of interest, certainly as a teacher, but also as a critic, and wondering why certain things worked the way they did. And stumbling on to behaviorism as yet another kind of psychological discourse that might be instrumentalized for explaining certain features, then finding that it really hadn't been part of literary history at all. And in that way, writing a dissertation that was primarily historical about its historical place. That's redundant, about its place in literary and critical history, all the while being very, very aware of the fact that I was not addressing the conceptual and sort of empirical origins, which was, how do we actually explain these features? How do I explain why I experience a text in the way that I do? And it was only after doing the history And then committing myself to an even longer history, both of literature and psychology, but also philosophy of mind, that I started seeing certain patterns. And I was then, with that bigger lens, then able to sort of isolate certain linguistic structures that I started to see associated with representations of mind or perceptions of mind that I found interesting, and then to realize that it wasn't really an association, that there really was a logical structure that these things all shared. And that process only took 13 years, 12 years.
13 years very well spent. It's a kind of related question, but and it's actually a question that I don't already know the answer to. I feel like I should, but I don't already know the answer to this question. To what extent did this book emerge out of the work on Beckett? It strikes me in reading the book as a whole that Beckett is in some sense the heart and soul and core of the book. He's the subject of 1.5 chapters. And for Coetzee, he's the sort of locus of interest in behaviorism. For him, you have some great material on his dissertation on the fiction of Beckett and its connection to behaviorist theories of language acquisition. Is that part of the story of how this book emerged, or is that just kind of an accident of how it came to be that Beckett kind of occupies this really central role?
I hope you wouldn't be upset if I said it was mostly accidental. I always loved Beckett. But the prevailing understanding of Beckett when I started, and still to this day, was that while he was interested in any number of things, that it didn't make sense to talk about him, say, in terms of behaviorism specifically. And indeed, I had to do quite a bit of kind of rooting around conceptually to find a way of making it meaningful about Beckett, in as much as I had the historical and biographical proof, but that wasn't the same as saying we need to think about these novels in these ways. So he is central to so much of the book, but conceptually, I'd say he is no more central than anyone else. That the new critics, both with respect to my training, but also chronologically in terms of the dissertation's kind of growth, came before Beckett. Coetzee probably came around the same time as Beckett, and then was cemented in place by virtue of his own dissertation on Beckett.
I'm going to start to turn to some of the questions that we have from the audience, and just also take this opportunity to encourage members of the audience to keep them coming, because there's some great questions here already. There's one that sort of connects with a question that I had too. It's a question about whether the problems that you're thinking about in this book work in the same way or differently when we think about lyric poetry. And it's, I had been thinking about this too, and it's actually, I think, sort of rare to find a monograph like this one that deals so beautifully and richly with 3 different genres: literary criticism, the novel, and drama, and really thinks carefully about the kind of different ways that these problems appear and move between these different genres. And so, of course, the question is, the one left out is poetry, and what's that about?
Poetry, I decided to defer to people who knew far more about poetry than I do, which are the new critics, specifically Brooks and Wimsatt, and then I.A. Richards as well. Part of me toyed with the idea of having a chapter just about poetry. But in the end, I thought it was actually more effective to talk about it through the criticism. And so, yeah, I do leave it out, but I would also maintain that, yes, I think the same things happen in poetry. If anything, the kind of mental effects that we see in lyric poetry rival those and are comparable to those of the novel. The way that, say, the smallest linguistic inflection can in fact create the perceived lyric speaker's thinking. And when, of course, that is not a mental phenomenon. It is a linguistic one, which then operates in somewhat unusual ways. But I think the category mistake of sort of mind and text there is just as operative. And in some ways, I think that lyric poetry is kind of in some ways, I think it's kind of the test case, if only for history's sake, because it is what the new critics spend so much time on. And it then becomes one of the hallmarks of the new critical tradition. And there are all sorts of, points made about the new critics that they really weren't very good about talking about novels. And I think that's true. And yet when I read them and think about the way they were talking about problems of mind, I don't see much problem crossing over between genres there or between modes.
There's another kind of related question here from the audience about whether this sensibility could offer an approach to other written works sort of beyond the literary. So in some legal areas, intentions, but not necessarily mental states, are irrelevant. Does this offer a way of observing minds there? I mean, is there a kind of history of behavioristic thinking in, for example, the law and the philosophy of the law?
Oh, that's I honestly do not know enough about the relation between literary criticism and the law. And so I defer to people like your current colleague and my former colleague, Simon Stern, on that point. And I honestly don't know enough about the way lawyers read. What I would say is, in any number of circumstances, we are relatively comfortable inferring or kind of putting together after the fact what we take to be the intention of someone who wrote a given document. We don't always have perfect knowledge of it, but often enough in those kinds of documents, we don't need to know exactly what they were thinking. When we read poetry or a novel, we operate somewhat differently, in part because in addition to sort of wondering about that, we are also putting as much weight on language as we possibly can and sort of seeing what happens to it. And so I think that changes the game. I don't think there is, again, I'm reluctant to say anything that could be used in court here. I don't know if there is a categorical way in which it could be transferred over, but I would assume that legal language or scholars of legal language would be more comfortable deferring to, say, ordinary language use than literary critics are, and perhaps arriving at an understanding of intention that way. Whereas I think one of the things that makes language literary as opposed to not literary is precisely that some rules that we would follow in other circumstances are no longer followed.
Mm. I mean, it seems to connect to, there's a running thread in the book about the possibility of kind of transcribing the contents of the mind. This is just me riffing on this question, but because you talk about Elaine Scarry's work in this way, that the idea in Dreaming by the Book that poets, novelists, et cetera, are sort of like transcribing for us kind of like instructions about how to imagine something. And it seems that, and then of course, thinking about something like Krapp's Last Tape, which the book has a wonderful reading of, being partly about that possibility of putting into a kind of physical form a transcription of one's own mental life. I don't know, there might be connections there between the law's interest in kind of being able to access in a kind of linguistic form intentions and mental states.
Yeah, it's just very much out of my wheelhouse, and I wouldn't want to speculate.
There's a question here about Wittgenstein. Can you relate your view to Wittgenstein's in regards to the publicity of language? I can answer that part. Yes, you can and do relate your view to Wittgenstein's throughout the book. And Wittgenstein's sort of indebtedness to an interest in behaviorism, and that the meaning of language is in the customs and actions in which it is embedded. Would that be different from behaviorism? So this might be an opportunity just to talk about a little bit about the place of Wittgenstein as one of the kind of important philosophical thinkers for the book. I think in addition to Ryle, certainly.
Yeah, no, I'm very much indebted to Wittgenstein. I think most explicitly to the investigations in this book, but in my own thinking, probably more to the Tractatus, which I actually think goes back to the question you just asked about, what kinds of things can be represented in what kinds of language. Yeah, I think the only issue with Wittgenstein is I was trying to get at something quasi-systematic that I think the investigations sort of gestures at, but because of its own aims, it doesn't really work as systematically. And also because I was really, and Wittgenstein has his own version of behaviorism, and it's not at all unlike what I'm working with, but it is often instrumentalized to different ends. And so, he is incredibly important. And with respect to the publicity of language, I think that is very much in the spirit. This is a book in many ways about the rules of different language games. That said, I would be lying if I claimed that he were really the person I kept going back to in my head, which was Ryle, and then obviously people like Watson and Skinner, but also Carl Hempel and his version of a philosophical behaviorism and the way a concept must operate.
One final question, also a question that was very much on my mind as I read, which is, could you talk about the implications of this work for teaching? How do you mobilize these conceptual approaches in the classroom? And it was on, I'll just add to this question as I've been doing. It's on my mind too, because so much of that first chapter about the history of close reading is about I.A. Richards' practical criticism as being a kind of, behaviorist pedagogical experiment. And so it's there kind of in the argument of the book, but, I think this question is important about how for you, this work on behaviorism, has it changed your approach in the classroom? Is there a kind of behaviorist sensibility for pedagogy as there is for reading?
Oh, that's an invitation to just sort of to go back into the dystopia. Yeah, I think there is an implication, although it might not be behavioristic in the strict sense. And also a lot of it just comes from my own teaching and my own experience, which is to say, one of the things I hate most is this sort of accepted notion that our students come to class to learn how they should have read. I get the idea that, part of my job is to give information to people who don't already have it. But I think that pedagogical practice actually reinforces one of the things about the discipline of literary criticism that is in some ways the most peculiar to me, which is this kind of ability to overlook the ways we actually experience things. And so certainly it was already kind of an unexpressed disposition of mine in the classroom, and it's only become more explicit that what I do in the classroom is I do not try to replace how they read. Instead, I try to offer them some explanation as to why they read the ways in the ways that they did, and from there go to other meaningful kinds of commentary, whether historical or theoretical or anything like that. Which is to say, I think it does come back to that kind of moment of trying to inculcate a certain sensibility among readers about working with all the information that you have. And I am not the only source of information of that in the classroom. And if I can't explain why someone reads something in a certain way, I don't see how I would be able to sort of, if only implicitly, say that it was irrelevant to what I was trying to lecture on.
We have one more question that has come in under the wire, and we have a few minutes left, so you have time to answer this one. The question is, I would like to hear more about your own peculiar practice of reading that you were mentioning earlier. What makes it peculiar?
Well, I mean, first, I think the fact that I am a professional reader, like many of the people reading, it's how I make my living, and also that it goes with that I have a lot of trouble reading for pleasure sometimes, and I think that's important. I would also say that my own peculiar practice as a reader are perhaps somewhat unexpected given the things I write about, which is I have almost no ability to remember character names or the names of anything, and I tend to gravitate towards books where things happen. And that kind of, that means that I'm reading some things for pleasure and other things not for pleasure. I would also say that I think even among sort of professional readers, I am probably more fixated on things like the way concepts are used than many, and the entailments of a given word's meaning or uses. So I meant it I'm a peculiar reader in the sense of, compared to all readers, but even within literary criticism, that fundamental question of what must be the case in order for me to experience things the ways that I do it's in many ways a very old-fashioned question. I think that earns the description of peculiar.
It's what makes for such an excellent and exciting book is precisely the peculiarity of your reading. And we're just about out of time, but I guess by way of conclusion, I want to say again what an absolute joy it's been to talk about this book with you, and what an absolute joy it was to read the book with this conversation in mind. It's a rare kind of pleasure to be able to read a book and then have this kind of conversation about it. And my great hope is that for those of you out there in the audience, that anything about this conversation has convinced you, as it should, that you should run out and buy the book and read it and cite it and assign it to your students. And you won't regret it. I will give you a personal refund if you do.
Don't make that promise.
Don't write that down. But on that note, thank you so much, Josh. It's been a real pleasure, and thanks so much for this conversation.
Thank you, Danny.